So we've all heard of Metropolitan Planning Organizations, or MPOs, but what exactly do they do? Where do they fit in the structure of local, state, regional, federal governments? And why and where do they exist? If you've ever had those questions but were too shy to ask, this session might be for you. Our panel today includes Rachel Drewlow, Executive Director of the Bismarck-Mandan MPO, Cindy Gray, Executive Director of the Fargo-Moorhead Metro COG, and Teri Kouba, Senior Planner, Grand Forks, East Grand Forks MPO. Please give them a warm welcome.
Hey, good morning, everyone. I'm going to go ahead and start our presentation here. If I believe it'll come up on the screen in a moment, but this, there we go. This morning we want to talk to you about Metropolitan Planning Organizations, as was stated, and just give you a little overview of how the work that we do fits in with the overall process of providing transportation services within our state. And so obviously the name of our presentation this morning was a little bit unusual. What do we mean by the 3 C's and the WWW? So we're going to tell you a little bit about that this morning, and kind of what, where, and why of metropolitan transportation planning, and what we mean by the 3 C's, which is kind of a core value and a core theme of all metropolitan transportation planning.
Is this microphone's on? Good. Well, as Cindy was mentioning, the MPO is guided by the 3 C's, and I'll maybe begin my slide by talking about maybe one of the obvious elements. MPOs are designed to help communities solve transportation problems. And no matter where you're at, your community has a transportation problem. It may be with your port or with your transloading facility, or maybe just your sidewalks. But overall, there are 3 overarching principles that all MPOs use when they're trying to solve these problems. That is continuing, cooperative, and comprehensive. We look at all modes of transportation, and we try to evaluate them in a multidisciplinary way. We work with all agencies from local levels all the way to federal levels, and our work repeats. What is seen as a transportation solution today may not be a good solution in 5 years. And so because of that, we're constantly evaluating the solutions that are derived. By being guided by these 3 C's, we ensure that all MPOs approach their transportation concerns from the same core values.
So what exactly do we do? Back in the 50s, when the interstate system was just being built, they ran into the idea that they came to realize that there needs to be more planning involved. Massive internet, and we needed to integrate into regional hubs. So they defined a regional hub as 50,000 or more in urban population. And they called these hubs metropolitan planning areas. These areas were established by federal law as the facilitators for the 3 C's to do the organized transportation planning, working with federal, state, county, township, city governing agencies, staff, and the public community to collaborate and coordinate with the transportation planning and programming.
So where do metropolitan planning organizations exist? Not only in North Dakota, but as you can see by this map, they exist all over the country. There are several hundred MPOs, and you can see how densely clustered they are on the East Coast and almost the whole state of Florida, the West Coast, and along a lot of our coastal areas throughout the country. But here in North Dakota, we have the MPO in Bismarck-Mandan metropolitan area, the Fargo-Moorhead metropolitan area, and the Grand Forks, East Grand Forks metropolitan area. And either as a result of the 2020 census or potentially 2030, it just depends on how the numbers come out. We may have our 4th MPO in the Minot area. So we will find that out sometime within this next year.
Well, welcome to Bismarck, anyone who's from out of town. On the slide here, I have an outline of the Bismarck-Mandan MPO area. You can see it in a slight green line. I have also included some basic demographics about the region, such as our population changes, the mileage of our important roadways, as well as mileage on some of our transportation networks specifically. I'll let you maybe take a picture of the slide, and if you want to geek out on the details, we can talk at it over lunch.
The Fargo-Moorhead metropolitan area is the largest MPO in North Dakota, made up of mostly North Dakota population, but also Minnesota, which makes up around 20% or so of our population. And our metropolitan statistical area, which is all of Cass and Clay County, is just a shade under 250,000. And from between the 2010 census and the 2010 census, our metropolitan area grew just about 20%. So we have 7 member jurisdictions made up of the 2 counties, and then the cities of Fargo, West Fargo, and Horace in North Dakota, and Moorhead and Dilworth on the Minnesota side.
And Grand Forks, East Grand Forks is the farthest north right now, and we are a very compact urban area, both in Grand Forks, North Dakota, and in East Grand Forks, Minnesota. We do go beyond the city limits and into about 2 to 4 miles beyond those city limits in our study area, but we do incorporate, but in our statistical area, we tend to include the population of Grand Forks County and Polk County as a whole. But Polk County is a very large county, and so it's not a very good population to look at when you're looking at the MPO area.
So one of the things that we wanted to talk with you about the most today was where MPOs fit in the whole process of delivering transportation services throughout the state and throughout the country, really, because this applies across the whole country. So at the beginning of that timeline, you'll see the planning and programming process. And it kind of circles back in on itself because like Rachel said, it's continuing. So we tend to look at things over and over. What's a good solution now or 5 years ago might not necessarily be a good solution now. So that's the end of the spectrum where our work lies. Many of you work in the preliminary and final design and NEPA process. And we're always aware of that process and aware especially of NEPA. When we're doing planning studies, we need to make sure that we're looking at what might become an issue when we get into that phase of the work. But really our work kind of stops in that green ring. And then ultimately, of course, many of you work in the right-of-way, utilities, and construction area. And the whole point of this is that we plan our work and we work our plan. So we always hope that while we're planning the future of the transportation system, that those of you who are working in the subsequent phases of that work will hearken back to the beginning of the process and look to inform yourselves about the planning aspect of the work that was done by our MPOs and by other entities in the state as well. But for our 3 biggest urban areas, it is the MPOs that do the bulk of this work. So an example of this, when we talked about this presentation with our local government division of the DOT, we thought it would be good to just provide an example of a project that really that many of you are aware of, that that covers the whole spectrum of this planning and design and construction process. So in around 2015 or 16, the Cheyenne Street corridor and the interchange with I-94 was studied extensively as part of a corridor study, looking at the existing conditions and what was working and what wasn't, looking at future traffic projections and the needs of that interchange and the needs of that corridor. And as part of that process, some preliminary layout type of things were put together. So you can see here that there are some just early sketches of what might fit within that right of way and what might work for that area, for that interchange area. There were a couple of different layouts and maybe more, but this is a couple representative examples. And of course, they were evaluated to look at how they would accommodate the future traffic projections, which are based on the future growth of our metropolitan area. Those are all aspects of our work that get rolled into these corridor studies and future plans. And of course, once that process was underway and they could, the team could see which interchange alternative was best meeting the needs of the future traffic projections, then the work got more in depth and more detailed. And so you can see here kind of a 3D rendering that was done of that interchange. And ultimately, once that was the direction that was decided on, those alternatives were evaluated as part of the NEPA process. Preliminary and final design took place, and the interchange went under construction and exists today, as you see it here in these photos. So this was a pretty short timeline in a 5 or 6 year period of time during which the planning and project development and construction took place for this interchange.
Before all that, as Cindy was saying, the MPO process did take forward and look at this as an organized all of the parties that were needing to work together to get the project put together. But it also included the neighborhood and the community as in general, in order to, understand what was needed for the community and for those who would be using the transportation network after it was built.
One of the major pieces of working with public goods is working with the public, right? And there are 3 documents that are developed and maintained by every MPO that discuss how our office is to address and interact with the public. Those 3 documents are known as the Public Participation Plan, the Limited English Proficiency Plan, and the Title VI Plan. So if you think back a couple of slides, we talked about plan your work and work your plan. These 3 documents guide the MPO's internal processes in how we are to work our plans. So they're very near and dear to our heart. They also keep us focused on who is helped by our planning projects and eventual construction projects, who is harmed by those plans and construction projects, and then who we haven't talked to, whose voice is important for us to know and to hear in order for their needs to be met by the transportation network.
In order for everybody to kind of get together and understand what kind of studies are going to be needed in the area, the MPO's Unified Planning Work Program is a biannual listing of what the MPO is going to accomplish in the next 2 years. We ask our partners, what are the priorities in the studies and plans that should be done? Then staff works with our boards in order to come up with the plan, what plans will be done in what year. And if staff or consulting firms will be doing the work based on basically what our budget is for that particular time frame.
A lot of the projects that are identified in our Unified Planning Work Program are the projects that are shown here in these blue and purple bubbles, the master plans, sub-area studies, and corridor studies. And this really, when we get down into the depths of these studies, it really starts to inform what we need to include in our Metropolitan Transportation Plan and what our priorities are and what it's going to cost us. So those master plan projects, an example of that is shown here, the Horace Comprehensive Plan that MetroCog participated in. And that laid out the future land use plan and the future transportation network for that community, which is really our fastest growing community in the Fargo-Moorhead area right now. So it was essential that we help them get a handle on their growth and their transportation needs. And so that's kind of an example of a master plan. A sub-area study is one that's like the one shown here, the Northwest Metro study for the Fargo and West Fargo area that looked at future land use and transportation needs in the area north of the urbanized area where Fargo and West Fargo are growing together. And so this really gives us an idea of where corridors need to be preserved, what the growth potential is for those areas, and where we have barriers to transportation network extensions that we need to deal with. And you can see this one goes over across I-29, just north of County Road 20, where the Amazon facility is now. So it goes to show how important it is that we have continuing planning going on, because when this study was done, we didn't know about Amazon and some of the other very transportation intensive industrial uses that we're going to be going up there in the very near future. So another example of our work is shown on the next slide, and that's the Veterans Boulevard Corridor Extension Study. That's a study that's just wrapping up right now. And this is looking at corridor alternatives for extending a section line arterial roadway that only exists down to 52nd Avenue today. And when we're looking at the future growth of Fargo and Horace, we know that we're going to need to look at extending that roadway. And what we know that it gives us a better idea of how extending that roadway affects other transportation infrastructure in our area. So those are just some examples of the kinds of work that we do as part of our Unified Planning Work Program, and that greatly informs the next step of the planning process.
Well, as Cindy explained, you've heard about our transportation plans, and the transportation plans are designed to create recommendations for solving transportation problems. But over time, all of those recommendations begin to look like baseballs after batting practice, and they're everywhere. So in our Metropolitan Transportation Plan, which is updated every 5 years, the MPOs work with state, federal, and local partners to collect all of those baseballs. And then we sort the baseballs. Some are good baseballs, some are less good baseballs, and others are, I could buy an island with the cost of that baseball. Within the MTP, the Metropolitan Transportation Plan, we try to select from those various baseball categories and figure out which projects can feasibly be done within a limited amount of money over the next 20 years. And what is the collection of construction projects that will most enhance and help our transportation networks. So this activity is done across all transportation networks within the Metropolitan Transportation Plan, but there's also other plans where we look at that process in a network-specific way, whether that be for our transit networks or for our bike ped networks. Oh, and sorry, all of this activity leads to selecting construction projects that are shown within our transportation improvement program.
And as most of you know of, you've heard of the State Transportation Improvement Program. The metropolitan planning areas all have their own transportation improvement program that is comprised of projects that are being built in the next 4 years using federal funding or are regionally significant. As you can see in the map, there are projects inside and outside the city limits. And we also make sure we're looking at how these projects impact areas where people have been less accommodated in the past. But now, how do we get to those projects being programmed? Basically, the MPO asks, we've worked with all our partners in order to put into our metropolitan transportation plan that these are going to be a priority for our partners. And now we're asking them, okay, what's your real priorities in the next 4 years? Based on what is in our fiscally constrained metropolitan transportation plan and an evaluation of how well those projects meet the goals of the metropolitan transportation plan. The MPO, working through our technical advisory committees and our executive policy boards, prioritize those projects. But then those projects still need to go to the state of North Dakota in order for them to be programmed with the federal funding. But once the MPO knows what those projects are in our MPO areas, we put them we create our own transportation improvement program. And we send it back to the state for inclusion into their state transportation improvement program.
So that kind of shows a wrap up of how the metropolitan transportation planning relates to the process as a whole. And we just like you can see here, we kind of blew up our planning process. And it's not that it's all that different from planning processes that are done outside the metropolitan planning area, but it is in that there's a much greater emphasis placed on public engagement, on continuity, and on the coordination with multiple jurisdictions and multiple agencies. And so that's really at the heart of what we do and what we strive to do. So with that, I think we're gonna wrap up. And we only had a short time today, so we didn't really plan on taking questions after the presentation, but all of us will be here for lunch and probably beyond. So if anybody has any questions about the process or anything, we would be more than happy to talk with you about those. So thank you.